Ken Gichinga. He's the chief economist at Mentoria Economics. Nice to have you, Mr. Gichinga. Thanks for joining us, and happy Jamhuri Day to you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, Mr. Gichinga, looking at Kenya 58 years down the line from when the Union Jack came down, how would you rate Kenya's economy, looking at where you started from and where you are today as a nation?
Well, I think that's a fantastic question. And I think one has to look at Kenya's history over the last 120 years. In fact, what I've argued is every 30 years, Kenya moves into a new phase, a new chapter. You start with the 1890s, 1900s. That's when the British settlers were coming into Kenya, expanding that railway. And within about 30 years, you could already feel the agitation amongst Africans for self-rule. And that took another 30 years to be able to get true independence as a country. And from the 1960s, again, it took 30 years to the 1990s for us to have political multi-party politics, because before that, Kenya was a single-party state. Yes. And now we're just about to complete another 30-year cycle. And the key focus right now will be on the economy now, because yes, we might be politically free as a country, but there is need for economic emancipation.
Okay, Mr. Ken Gichinga, we know that Kenya has a Vision 2030 where we have a current blueprint for the future of economic growth. But from statistics, we know that Kenya is also highly dependent on foreign aid. Do you think Kenya can achieve this Vision 2030?
Well, the Vision 2030 was set out in 2008 with the whole purpose of making Kenya middle-income country. It's interesting, within a couple of years, Kenya was declared a middle-income country, but it was more of looking at ratios on paper than on reality. I think what we have in Kenya is we've had growth, about 5% growth, but it's been largely driven by government spending. I think what the economy needs right now is private sector investment. We need to get more private sector players so that we can fulfill the true dreams of the economy. So I think a large part of the Vision 20 was on infrastructure. There's been a big focus on infrastructure, even with the current administration. But the challenge has been, because of that infrastructure, the country has had to borrow a lot. Debt levels have gone significantly higher, and now there's need for the country to change course.
Now, looking at present-day realities, Mr. Gichinga, the COVID-19 pandemic and now the Omicron variant that the whole world is describing. COVID has been described by economists and everyone as the great disruption, and I'm sure you agree with me. It's hit the global economy. In 2020, Kenya's economy has been hurt by the COVID-19. It expected GDP in 2020, GDP growth decelerated to 1.4% from 5.4% in 2019. Now, what steps can policymakers take to support Kenya's economic recovery?
You're absolutely right. The COVID pandemic really hit the Kenyan economy hard. Things had been slowing down even before the pandemic came to the shores. But what the pandemic did is it accelerated that slowdown, and many businesses were shut, jobs were lost, and pretty much everybody was affected. That said, the country now is relaxing its measures. There's a sense of recovery as things start to reopen. The curfews have been lifted, but there is that election coming up next year. So there's a bit of worry that the recovery we might have might end up being affected by next year's just political cycle. So we do hope that the country remains on an even keel and that growth continues, because sectors such as hospitality have been drastically affected and will need some time to be able to recover.
Okay, let's look at economic recovery. We're still looking at economic recovery. And despite the fact that COVID-19 has affected the world and also Kenya, we do know that Kenya is a bit reliant on the rain-fed agriculture and tourism. What are the ways that Kenya can diversify its economy and grow its revenue?
Well, the Kenyan economy is actually quite diversified. I mean, if you compare it to many African countries, it's pretty much diversified. And that's pretty much because Kenya really does not have a huge number of natural minerals or resources like other African countries. So the services sector are quite vibrant, they're quite diversified. I think the challenge has been accessing credit. Right now, credit to the private sector has been below 10% in terms of growth of credit. And I think that's where the challenge is. When the government borrows a lot, then the public debt is very high. You crowd out the private sector. So credit that could have gone to private sector goes to government. So I think that's really the big challenge, being able to stimulate most of these sectors that had been hit hard.
And like you mentioned earlier, Mr. Gichinga, a lot of this borrowing goes into major infrastructure projects. And in the last 10 years, we've seen the train line from Nairobi to Mombasa. We've seen quite a number of projects too. Citizens will see this borrowing as a sacrifice, a way of, saving for rainy days, necessary things that have to be there. Would you say that the borrowing is commensurate with the infrastructure projects you've seen on the ground, or is there still a huge infrastructure deficit in Kenya?
Well, it's true. There is an infrastructure deficit in the country, in Africa, and infrastructure has its place in building an economy. I think the challenge that Kenya and most African countries have had is they've had a debt-financed infrastructure. And the problem of the model Kenya and many African countries have taken is they sink money into huge projects that don't generate enough cash flow to pay back the loans. So you find Kenya is heavily indebted to China, like many African countries. And the countries really have to part with quite a bit of interest repayments to be able to survive. And that's money that could have gone to other sectors. So I think what needs to happen is we need to find a better way of financing infrastructure. One way that is being talked about here is through PPP, public-private partnerships. But I think we need to think of how do we build infrastructure in a sustainable way so that it doesn't drain all the resources from the national coffers.
Do you feel population growth has outstripped economic growth in Kenya?
Not quite. Actually, if you really think about it, the most of the populated areas are around the cities. So Nairobi, Mombasa, Nakuru, Kisumu, Eldoret. But you'll find pretty much the rest of the country it's very sparsely populated. So I think devolution was a game changer in 2010 when we created counties with county governments. And I think the idea was when these county governments are up and running, they'll be able to reduce that rural to urban migration, and people will be able to find careers in their home counties and decongest these big cities. So I think if devolution, and I think devolution is one of the best things that has happened in Kenya. If we can get devolution right and have all 47 counties, then we will not have any issues of stretched infrastructure by population.
My question to you is, it's instructive that on Independence Day, on Jamhuri Day, we talk about financial independence, because the late Burkinabe revolutionary Captain Thomas Sankara said, "He who feeds you controls you." And many developing countries in sub-Saharan Africa, including Kenya, are heavily reliant on foreign aid. Some statistics here from the World Bank. From 1970 to 1999, donor funds received by Kenya averaged about 9% of GDP. This accounted for 20% of the annual budget. and 80% of development expenditure. How much has Kenya done to wean itself off dependency on aid?
I think he did quite a bit during the Kibaki administration when former President Kibaki came into power. He was very keen on a country that's self-reliant, and you could see there was less and less need for the IMF, for the World Bank, or any of the Bretton Woods institutions. And the country really started collecting taxes. The Kenya Revenue Authority became a very powerful entity, and the country started powering itself back. And that, I think, was one of the best things the country did. However, the current administration, unfortunately, went back into the debt cycle that had riddled the country in the 90s. So I think it's very important that we pick up from where former President Kibaki left, where we reduce our loans and we start collecting more revenue, be more sustainable, because what Sankara said is very true. There's no difference. We might have political freedom now, but many Kenyans don't have economic freedom. Where maybe there was guns in the fight against for freedom, now the new fight is against debt. Our public debt is heavy, and even private debt is very heavy. A lot of citizens are using these private mobile lending apps, really getting into debt in all these apps. So it's time for the country really to now think about economic freedom now that we have political freedom.
Okay, lastly, what are your wishes for Kenya as it celebrates 58th independence anniversary?
Well, I think it's first, as the national anthem says, the last stanza, that let our hearts be filled with thanksgiving. Many people have fought for this country, people have died, blood has been shed for the freedoms that we enjoy. Kenya remains one of the freest countries in Africa. We have a free media, we have freedom of expression, freedom of association, and my wish is that Kenyans would use these freedoms in a responsible way to be able to create a more prosperous country.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ken Gichinga. It's been an absolute pleasure having you, and happy Independence Day to you.